Winter is one of those times a year where hunts can just go quiet. You can cover a lot of country and not see much at all. But the thing is, the deer are still here. They're just living very differently to what people expect at this time of year. And once you start noticing a few of those patterns, it stops feeling so random. Some of the more consistent encounters I've had have actually been in the middle of winter. As things start cooling down, everything for red deer just comes back to energy. They're not moving around just for the sake of it anymore. They don't have the same reason to move around as much as they do earlier in the year, so you start to see them tightening up a bit. Smaller movements, shorter windows. A lot of the time they'll feed, then get themselves somewhere sheltered and just sit tight for long periods of time. And you do start noticing that areas that used to hold good numbers of deer start to feel pretty empty. If you're still hunting winter deer the same way you hunted earlier in the year, it can feel pretty much like everything's just switched off. One thing that can make winter hunting frustrating is knowing where to even start looking. Because once you find areas that the deer are actually using, a lot of the rest just starts to fall into place. A lot of the time, I'm just looking for areas that make life easier for the deer in winter. Places that are getting decent sun during the day, sheltered from the worst of the wind, and areas that they don't have to expend a lot of energy moving around. You also start to notice how closely tied together feed and cover become. If deer can feed and then not travel too far back to their security, those areas can become pretty reliable. And bedding areas start to make a lot more sense too. You'll often find them wanting somewhere sheltered, dry, with a good view and escape route. The more winters you spend understanding terrain, the less random deer locations start feeling. A big part of it honestly just comes back to pattern recognition. You might glass a certain kind of face and keep turning up deer there, and after a while you'll notice similarities between that and other areas. Quite often, country that holds winter deer isn't impressive looking country. Instead of just randomly covering country, you start to narrow down areas that make the most sense for deer to spend winter. One thing I've noticed with winter deer is even if you are in the right area, they can be surprisingly hard to find. A lot of the time, they're not out feeding in the open for long periods of time. You'll often get short movement windows, then long stretches of time where the deer have tucked away somewhere comfortable. Sometimes they'll feed briefly, then disappear back into cover and stay there for hours. And because they're moving less overall, it can make a block feel completely empty if you're moving through it at the wrong time of day. I think winter really rewards patience behind the glass. Because quite often, deer don't just suddenly appear. You start noticing little bits and pieces of them. You might catch the flick of an ear, the shape of a backline, or something standing up after being bedded for a long period of time. And once you spot deer, you suddenly realise how easy they are to miss. The amount of times I've glassed a face, thought it was completely empty, Then started to pick up deer. It happens a lot over winter. Winter is also when you start noticing the effects of pressure on deer. Areas that are easy to get into or get hunted regularly can start to feel pretty quiet during daylight hours. But again, it doesn't necessarily mean that deer aren't there. They're just adjusting, moving less during the day, moving into rougher country, or just using the area differently. You can be in an area that absolutely should hold deer, and it probably does. You're just moving through it out of sync with how they're using the area. Sometimes the difference between seeing deer and not is only a couple of 100 metres. I definitely slow things down when I'm hunting in winter. Spend a lot of time behind the glass, really picking apart country and looking into cover. And a lot of the time, movement doesn't really start happening till later in the morning, sometimes even in the middle of the day. A lot of movement happens after most people have moved on. In thicker country, patience becomes a big part of it. Just moving slowly, stopping often, and letting things settle. Some of the better encounters I've had have honestly come from just standing still a lot longer than I thought was necessary. Once you start understanding where they're feeding and where they feel comfortable bedding, those areas in between can become really interesting. You don't need to see heaps of deer, you just need to be in the right place when one decides to move. It often only takes one opportunity. Game cameras can be really useful at this time of year too. I tend to focus more on feeding areas, edges of cover, or routes in between bedding and feed. And honestly, it's less about getting heaps of pictures and more about getting reliable intelligence on where the deer are moving to and from. This is the time where having your game camera on video is probably more effective than having it set to pictures. Even seeing what time of day deer are moving through and which direction they're going can really help you piece the puzzle together. Sometimes all it takes is a couple of clips to completely change how you're going to hunt a spot. There are definitely a few things that seem to catch people out in winter, and moving too quickly is probably the biggest one. It's easy to feel like you need to cover a lot of ground if you're not seeing much. But a lot of the time, slowing down actually gives you a better chance. And I've definitely done it myself. Written spots off as empty, only to realise they were probably holding deer the whole time. Winter hunting definitely feels different. Everything just slows down a bit. But once you start paying attention to how deer are actually using the country, everything starts to feel a little bit less random and a little bit less like you're trying to get lucky.